Okay, next one on our list is E96. E96 says Solar Innovations Corporation bought a machine at the beginning of the year at a cost of $22,000. The estimated useful life was 5 years. The residual value was $2,000. Assume that the estimated productive life of the machine is 10,000 units. Expected annual production for year 1 was 2,000, year 2, 3,000, etc., etc. Part 1, completed depreciation schedule for each of the alternative methods, round answers to the nearest dollar. So they want straight line, units of production, and double declining balance method. Okay? I've written some information up here to kind of help save us some time. We're going to go over some of the first calculations in the first year, and then kind of walk through the rest, as they'll be pretty self-explanatory after you get the first one out of the way. All right, looking at straight line. Formula for straight line is you take the original cost. They tell us that the cost is $22,000, right? Minus the residual value. This gives us our depreciable basis. So the residual value they tell us is $2,000. So we have $20,000 as our depreciable cost, right? It tells us then that we multiply by the fraction used. So, for instance, we use every single year 1 year, and the useful life is 5 years. So we multiply by 1/5, or we could just divide by 5. And that gives us 4 per year, right? Because it's going to be the same every single year. So let's fill in our depreciation schedule. For depreciation expense, we're going to have 4 every single year. Why? Straight line is the same amount every single year. So we can just draw a line down here. It's going to be $4,000 every single period. If we go on to cost, cost is $22,000. That's the original cost of the asset. Same every single period, right? Historical cost principle. $22,000 goes there. For accumulated depreciation, in year 1, we begin with 0, right? So accumulated depreciation is equal to depreciation expense. So we simply put 4 there, right? So if we look at this, notice that accumulated depreciation, it increases by 4 every single period, right? Every single period it increases by 4 because depreciation expense every single period is 4, right? If we take our cost minus our accumulated depreciation, we get net book value. Net book value for the first year is going to be $18,000. Notice that net book value decreases by the amount of depreciation expense that increases, right? Or accumulated depreciation that increases. Why? Because accumulated depreciation increases when depreciation expense is recorded, right? So net book value will decrease by $4,000 every single period. Notice that at the end here, our net book value, $2,000, is equal to our residual value that we had, $2,000 at the very beginning. Okay? The next one that it wanted us to do was units of production method. All right. Units of production method, different calculation to get this, but same first part, right? Because we still use depreciable basis. So we take 22,000 minus 2,000 gives us 20,000. 20,000 is our depreciable basis. I'm going to try to squeeze this in right here. So we have 20,000. We then can do a number of different things, right? I've written out to the side here each of the expected units that we expect to produce every single year, right? It tells us, gives us that in the information. 2,000 year 1, 3,000 year 2, etc., etc. So we could multiply by a fraction, taking year 1, 2,000, over the total estimated units that it's supposed to produce, which is 10,000, right? So we could do that, but something that I think is simpler is we simply take this 20K and divide by the total estimated amounts, which is 10K. These are the total units that we're expecting to produce, right? And it gives us a rate. This rate is 2. 2 is our rate that we have every single time we produce yearly amounts, right? We multiply by that rate, by 2. So if we have 2,000 that we expect to produce for the units for year 1 and multiply by a rate of 2, we should get 4,000 for our depreciation expense for year 1, right? 2 times 2. So we have 4,000 here. If we do our cost, it's still 22,000. It's the same no matter what method that you use, right? 22,000, that's our cost, historical cost principle. For accumulated depreciation, again, accumulated depreciation, 0 at the beginning of year 1, so we just take over depreciation expense. Depreciation expense here is 4. And then net book value, again, our cost minus accumulated depreciation. I'll just put a formula right in here for you. That equals net book value of 18. Now notice, in the units of production method, the actual depreciation expense varies. Why? Because the units produced vary, and the units produced are termed to be the life of the asset instead of years, as we see in the straight line method, right? So if we take our rate again, 2 times 2 was 4, 2 times 3 was 6, 2 times 2 is 4, etc., right? So those are the depreciation expense you record every single year, right? Notice that accumulated depreciation increases by the amount of depreciation expense recorded. So in year 1, you had 0, so you record 4, so it increases by 4. In year 2, right, you have 6. Now accumulated depreciation, which is a running tally, is now 10. Depreciation expense, that's a period expense, goes on the income statement. Accumulated depreciation goes on the balance sheet. It's a contra account, right? So we have 4,000 here for the first year. We increase by depreciation expense, get to 10,000, right? Again, if you subtract cost, so year 2 was 22,000, same historical cost principle, minus accumulated depreciation 10,000, now we're at a net book value of 12,000, right? So it follows the same formula in terms of just calculating net book value. It's always cost minus accumulated depreciation. Residual value here is 2,000, just like it was under the straight line method. Let's go to double declining balance, okay? Double declining balance method, our straight line would have been 1/5. So double declining balance is going to be 2/5, right? It's twice what the straight line method would be, okay? Our total cost for the asset was 22,000. Remember that double declining balance method does not use depreciable basis as we're familiar with it with straight line and units of production. Instead, double declining balance method uses net book value, right? In the first year, like we've been saying in all these problems, accumulated depreciation is 0. So at the beginning at least. So the net book value is 22,000, which is equal to the cost of the asset, right? So I just went ahead and wrote cost up for here since we've done it in these other two parts. If we take 22,000, our net book value at the beginning of the year, times the rate, 2/5 or 40%, we get 8,800. This is our depreciation expense for the first year, right? 8,800. And notice since we start with a 0 balance for accumulated depreciation, our accumulated depreciation is 8,800, right? Our net book value is then simply the 22,000, I'll write a K so that these are constant, 22,000 minus the 8,800, our net book value should be 13,200 for that first year, right? What's the next step? What do we do to get these remaining amounts that I've written out? Well, let's start multiplying the net book value, which is what we do here. The only reason why we use cost is because we had a 0 accumulated depreciation. So now we have a net book value that has reduced the cost by the accumulated depreciation. So now we got 13,000. Let's make this clearer since I know you're on a video. I want to make sure you can read that. 13,200, right? We multiply that out times the rate, which is 40% or 2/5, right? And that gives us our next year's depreciation expense, right? So then depreciation expense for this year, year 2, is added to prior year's accumulated depreciation, which gives us the new accumulated depreciation. Cost, 22,000, minus the new accumulated depreciation gives us the new book value. We then multiply that book value by the 40%, giving us the next year's depreciation expense, and et cetera, et cetera. The only year which it changes, and the thing that you really have to pay attention to when you do double declining balance method, is in year 5. Year 5, if we were to multiply this net book value, this 2,851 by 40%, we would get 1,140. But if we took the 1,140 from the net book value of the prior year, right, we would go below the residual value. You have to remember that when double declining balance uses net book value, you still have to take into consideration the residual value. You can't ignore it. You can never go below the residual value. So we would have done 1,140, but we're going to cross that bad boy out. Why? Because we instead can only go down to the residual value. So we had 2,851. The residual value is 2,000. If we took this and subtracted 2,000 from it, we know that the only amount that we can depreciate is $851, right? So then we take our 851, we add it to the 19,149. We should get 20,000, right? And that makes sense. Why? Because our cost was 22,000, and at the end of the useful life of the asset, the net book value should always be equal to the residual value. So now we have $2,000 here on a residual value. So we'll cross out what this would have been if we would have subtracted out 1,140, which is our original calculation over here. 2,851 times the 40%, we would have got a net book value of 1,711, and that would have been below the $2,000 threshold that we can't go below, right? All right, these are the 3 methods. The last part asks us of this problem. It says, which method will result in the highest net income for year 2? Does this higher net income mean the machine was used more efficiently? Well, if we look in year 2, the depreciation expense, the only thing that actually goes to the income statement, right? The depreciation expense goes to the income statement. Cumulative depreciation goes to the balance sheet. The cost obviously is on the balance sheet. So we're only concerned with depreciation expense. So let's look at year 2. Year 2 depreciation expense, 4,000, because it was the same every single year for straight line, right? If we look at depreciation expense year 2 for units of production, 6,000. That's higher than 4,000. That's going to mean net income is lower. That means that we don't want that one. Go on to double declining balance method, 5280. That's obviously higher than 4,000. So straight line is going to give us the highest net income, right? But does this mean that we use this asset more efficiently by recording straight line? No, it absolutely does not. Remember that these methods are estimates, right? All three are acceptable by GAAP. You're supposed to choose the one that best reflects the economic benefit use, right? But all three are acceptable. These could be the exact same circumstances, but just different companies, and they each use their own professional judgment to decide how to recognize the use or the economic benefit that they're receiving from the asset. Okay? So study these. This will definitely be on your test. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or let me know. Thanks.